Well, in those days, you have to remember, I retired in 1980, and there was the Cold War, there was Red China,
Yeah.
there was the Soviet Union, all of the Iron Curtain, all of those things. So it wasn't so easy. Now, I was determined that if I were going to do it, I was going to do it right. I wasn't just going to, go down through Europe to Australia and then up to South. Because people would always say, or at least I would have always said, you didn't really go around the world. You did the easy way. So I was determined that I had to go across China and I had to go across the Soviet Union. Now, think back, if you can, to those days. That was absurd and impossible. I went to China in 1984, terrified because I'd been reading how dangerous and vicious and cruel the Chinese were. But got there and they weren't vicious and cruel and dangerous. I've been reading American propaganda all my life. And I said, I want to ride across China on a motorcycle. You look back on that, that's insane.
Yeah.
Capitalist, American, 1984. Mao Zedong had only been dead 8 years. If I was smart, I would have realized that it was opening up. I would have realized what Deng Xiaoping was doing better. But the Soviets, the same thing. He was an American, capitalist, Wall Street, who wanted to ride a motorcycle across the Soviet Union. I remember finally when somebody would listen to me, and I knocked on a lot of doors. Finally, when a guy listened, I went to Moscow. He wrote me and said, yeah, come, you can do this, which shocked me because I've been trying for 9 years. And he said, why would you want to do this? There's nothing out there. There are no roads. There's nothing out there. And I said, well, I just, I've got this crazy vision that's what I want to do. And so they said yes, to my shock. But finally, I got permission from the Chinese. I got permission from the Russians. But this took a long time. It wasn't so easy in those days. And I will tell you just an aside, 10 years later, in 1998, I contacted that Russian again and said, I want to do it again. Well, this time I'm going to do it in the car. He said, I knew you were crazy. Anybody who would do it once has to be crazy, but anybody who wants to drive across Siberia twice has to be certifiable. Well, we know you're not a spy, so I said, we're going to let you do it.
Well, plus he knows that you were slightly less crazy because at least you wanted a roof over your head this time. I guess that's...
yeah, that's for sure.
So, but that moment when you cross into, to your point, what at that time was communist East Germany, you're leaving the confines of the West, and by that time you developed a familiarity with European markets, and you traveled through Austria, and there's some great stories which you and I actually spoke about in the first time we sat down for Real Vision. But that moment where you leave behind essentially everything you know, the entire way of life that you know, and you venture into something completely unknown. How did that affect you? How did that strike you?
I know, I'm sure I am nuts, but I would think about this. People would say, you're going to get killed. And I would say, well, at least if I get killed, I'm going to die happy. I'd rather get killed riding my motorcycle around the world than getting hit by a bus on Fifth Avenue in New York, when I'm 60 years old or something. At least I'm going to die happy. I'm going to die doing what I want to do. And I tell myself that all the time. Who knew? Who knew that I was going to make it alive? But I did. And every time there was a new border or a new anything, I mean, when you're going around the world every day, every 5 minutes is something new. No matter where you are, it's all brand new. And I used to say, well, at least if I get killed. But it was so exciting and so much fun and so challenging. There was always a challenge. Even when things went wrong, you learned something. So it was, I don't know. I guess I am nuts as I hear myself speak.
But that's precisely why I wanted to talk to you about this stuff. That sense that there's always a challenge. Something always goes wrong, but you figure it out. I mean, what was the first moment once you left the confines of America and you got to Europe, you were driving through? What was the first time you found yourself faced with what I'm sure at the time felt like an insurmountable problem that you had to overcome, whether it was a visa, a border, a broken down motorbike in the middle of nowhere? What was that first moment where you really thought, oh my God, I'm doing this and I'm out here on my own and I need to figure this out?
The very first day we went to the west coast of Ireland because I wanted to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The very first day, some drunk Irish driver almost ran us down because he was drunk and he was crazy. And the police came along too because they could see something was wrong. I figured, well, I could get killed doing this. When I went around the world in the car, we started in Iceland for a variety of reasons. And the third day out, we got trapped in a blizzard. She was my fiance at the time. My wife said, "What am I doing with you? What are you talking about? This is fun. This is insane." I said, "No, this is it. This is why we do it." She didn't see it quite that way when we were trapped in a blizzard and had to be towed out of a snowbank.
Well, yeah, I can imagine that spending that time with your fiance in a car in a blizzard, that sounds like a big challenge to me. I can imagine any two people in that sort of space.
Well, I will tell you that, as you know, or most people know, that if you drive anywhere with somebody, it's a very, very serious test of a relationship. I mean, I know people who couldn't drive from Singapore to Malaysia without getting in a fight with somebody. It is a great, great test of any relationship. We were at the last stages of our trip, Paige and I, we were in Palo Alto, actually, and a woman came over to us and said, "Oh my, this is my dream. I always want to do what you're doing. I cannot believe that." And then she looked at the car and she said, "Well, wait a minute, that's a two-seater, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it's two-seater." She said, "You in a two-seater side by side every day for 3 years, 240,000 kilometers?" That's what it was. And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh my God, my fiance and I set out to drive from the East Coast of America to the West Coast, and we hate each other. Halfway through, he got out, and I didn't even slow down. I was so happy to get in front of a bitch." So it's true. It is true. I don't think we didn't have plenty of challenges and fights along the way. One of the great things about a motorcycle is if you have a fight with somebody, you get on your motorcycle and you go, and the fight, is gone by the time you get to the next place. But in a car, the fight stays there. The fight doesn't go away. It's riding along with you.
Well, to have done this twice, once on your own and once with a partner along the way, how did the two compare? Because I mean, obviously pros and cons for both. Because I think if when you're on your motorbike and you want to move on, you just get up and you move on, and you just I'm going to go to the next place, and I'm going to go here, and I'll take a different route, or I'll do something different, and you can just do that. Did Paige just kind of come along, ride shotgun, and just enjoy the ride, or did you find that you had to kind of plan this whole thing together the second time around?
In the beginning, Paige was a nightmare of a travel companion. Even Germany scared her. She thought, "Oh my gosh, here I am in Germany. What are we going to do?" So you can imagine when we got to Turkey and Central Asia and places like that. But by the end, I mean, she was a fabulous international traveler. She could cross borders with the best of them. She could spit in their eyes just like anybody else. But boy, for the first several thousand kilometers, she was a mess. I didn't know which was tougher, the trip or dealing with her. But by the end, she was, she could do it.
And when you finish that trip, your investment style is to my mind an example to everybody, because you do incredible research, you find your ideas, and then you stick with them. And now a part of that is the latitude of investing your own money. So you have the time, you can do that. You can invest for generations if you choose to. But when you finish those journeys, had your investing style changed? Because I always get the sense that you've always been, I use the word contrarian just because I can't think of a better one at the time being. I don't mean a contrarian for contrarian's sake, but had the experience of being on Wall Street, where you're just immersed in the U.S. markets, U.S. stocks, the Wall Street Journal, and really not much else outside, had experiencing all these things, did it change your investment style in any way?
Well, no, I had always invested all around the world, long and short, and all, stocks, commodities, bonds, currencies, everything. Since my very first days on Wall Street, because I had this madness about the world, I had always done that. I even, if you can imagine the 60s, telling people that I'm investing in the Danish krona, I mean, they'd walk out of the room. I mean, we don't waste our time on whoever this kid is. No, so I had always done that, and so that part didn't change. Of course, found new markets and new things. But I was eager. I was very eager to find new things and new markets.
And when you got back to the US, what was the place that you found yourself talking about to everybody? What was the place saying, you know what, this country was just such a complete revelation to me, and the people, the markets, whatever it may have been?
Well, the place that I talked most about, but I had started before, was China. And if you can remember the 90s, everybody was worried about the Japanese threat and Japan taking over the world. And I would say, I'd be on television or so, I'd say, forget Japan. What are you talking about? You got to worry. If you're going to worry, you got to worry about China. And they're not a worry. You don't have to worry. You just better get up to date on what's happening in China, because China is going to be the most important country in the 21st century. And that, of course, caused great guffaws and ridicule and everything else. Now it doesn't cause guffaws and ridicule, but it certainly did then.
But when you talk about China now, obviously there are two very distinct camps in China. There are China's a disaster waiting to happen, and there's going to be a credit crisis. There's going to be a crash over there, and there are the other long-term investors like yourself that believe that there will be bumps along the way, but China is going to be just fine. When you hear the guys, and very high-profile, very smart guys, we had Kyle Bass on here a couple of weeks ago, and Kyle makes a very eloquent case for why he thinks there's an enormous credit bust on its way to China. When you hear these guys talk, what goes through your mind? Do you look through that and think through that, and it's not such a concern to you because you're a long-term outlook?
Well, if we were sitting here in 1917, somebody could have said, there's going to be a huge credit bust in the United States in the next decade or two. And you might have stayed away from the United States investing. And there was a gigantic credit bust in 1929 in the US in the 30s. But America became the most successful country in the 21st century, in the 20th century. America had many. In the 19th century, America had 15 depressions with a D. I mean, only a nut would invest in the U.S. for the most part in the 19th century. And many Europeans just could not fathom investing in the U.S. Well, okay, China's going to have plenty of problems, I assure you. There are going to be bankruptcies. Beijing has said they're going to let people go bankrupt. I hope they do. It'll be good for China. It'll be good for the world if China does let people go bankrupt. But that's part of it. I mean, capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without sin or something. I mean, you've got to have problems and delays along the way. And China will too. I just hope I'm smart enough to survive it. I hope I'm smart enough to be in the right places at the right time. And by the way, Grant, the Chinese have a wonderful word. It does not exist in English, but the word is Weiji, which means opportunity and catastrophe are the same thing. Yeah. And as we all know, it's true. If you see houses burning down, it's a disaster, but there are also opportunities if you can figure them out. So I hope that when Weiji comes to China, that I'm smart enough to do the right thing.
But you said to me in our first interview that you were the worst timer in the world. You're just not a trader. You're an investor. So I mean, China is a long-term investment story that you've been involved in for literally decades now. So do you worry about these things coming, or do you think to yourself, well, when these busts come, I'm not going to worry about the investments I have because these, I've had a lot of these for 10, 15 years, but it'll be a great chance for me to invest more capital into this country when things are on sale?
Well, that's my plan, but now I haven't sold any Chinese shares, and I have been investing there for decades. My plan is that my children someday are going to look down and say, he must have been a smart old guy. Look at all these Chinese shares we got. We're rich. That's my plan. But, if things develop in certain ways, I'll have to sell. I mean, if a bubble develops, you have to sell, for instance. So I may sell some of my Chinese shares between here and there. I would like to not. I'd like to sell. I'd like to hold my Chinese shares through the Great Depression if it comes to China. I doubt if I will, but I then hope that I'm smart enough to buy more, to buy a lot more. I mean, the idea of Weiji is fabulous, and I hope I get it right.
Something I'm fascinated by, and I like to talk to a lot of people about this because I'm still trying to figure out what I think about this myself. But when you look at Bitcoin, for example, this is something that has come out of the clear blue sky for a lot of people. When you talk about bubbles, that when you have to sell, what do you think when you look at Bitcoin? Because obviously in China now, it's incredibly popular, and it's the bulk of the trading is done in China. What do you make of it?
Every word you just said is true until 2 days ago, 3 days ago.
Right.
Now the
Yes.
Chinese have outlawed, totally outlawed cyber currencies, trading, offering them offerings, etc. Well, I never have owned any cyber currencies. I say with great embarrassment. I wish I had, obviously, but now there are 2,000 of them, up from nothing a few years ago. I mean, this is what bubbles feel like and look like and sound like, as you well know, Grant. So is it a bubble? I don't know. It looks like it. It feels like it. The idea that 2,000 of these have appeared out of nowhere and that they go up. You look at the charts of Bitcoin and the others. I mean, they look like any other bubble, those kind of charts. They all look the same. All bubbles throughout history have looked and felt the same. I'm certainly not buying any now. Without the Chinese and a few other people, they're going to have to find some markets pretty quickly if it's going to work. Now, the idea of currency, of money on the computer is certainly something that's going to happen in our lifetimes. And the world has money problems. Nearly everything that we know is being changed by the computer and by the internet. My kids will never go to a bank when they're adults. They'll probably never go to a post, may never go to a doctor when they're adults, because everything is on the computer. Well, money's going to be on the computer too. That does not mean it's going to be Bitcoin or some of these guys that are racing around. If you've gone back 100 years ago, there were hundreds of automobile companies. Only 25 or so survived. You go back 50 years, there were thousands of computer companies. But we've all heard of IBM, but IBM didn't invent the computer. We haven't even heard, you've probably never heard of the people who invented the computer and all of those companies that disappeared.
Well, that's it's this whole Bitcoin phenomenon has just everybody seems to have an opinion on it, and I'm fascinated by how strongly everybody has taken their sides with this. Everybody, if you are pro Bitcoin and you own Bitcoin, you absolutely refuse to see it as a bubble, and not only that, but people get really quite aggressive when you question that maybe this thing's a bubble. When you look at what's happened with Bitcoin and you go back to the 1970s and you remember the bull market in gold, which again, to your point, had a very similar chart pattern when gold in the 1980s. Do you see any parallels there? Because the two do get compared frequently, gold and Bitcoin, as potential stores of value. But obviously there is that tangibility to gold that you just don't have with Bitcoin. Does this look and feel familiar to you?
Well, I've lived through a few bubbles. I've shorted a few bubbles. I've read about many, many, many other bubbles. They're always the same. And when you say that, when people always say that, they always ridicule you. They always make fun of you when you say this is a bubble. I've had it happen to me many, many, many times. So the more people who insist that you're nuts and that this is not a bubble, that it's different this time, the fact that you're hearing that kind of stuff probably confirms that we're, if not in a bubble, we're certainly forming a bubble.
Yeah, well, that's Bitcoin is. I guess that the end of that story is still to be written, but I'm watching it with absolute fascination, particularly in light of what the Chinese have done this last week. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the mailbag, Jim. I've had a bunch of questions in for you, but the first one we're going to ask you. Our guest last week, Hugh Hendry, and Hugh, bless him, gave us this interview on the day he closed his hedge fund, and he was, remarkably upbeat about life and everything, as Hugh tends to be. He's one or the other, but it was a fascinating conversation, and he told us a story when we said to him that Jim's coming on next week and we'd love a question for him. He told us a story of a time you and he met at a party in Moscow, which is a long, long time ago. And he told us that he was sitting talking to you and was just wrapped with what you were talking to him. He said at one point you pulled out a gold coin and you said, you know, Hugh, look, you've got to own gold. And he said later on in that same conversation, you pulled out some sugar from somewhere and said, the other thing you have to own is sugar. And so based on that, here is Hugh Hendry's question for you.
Oh, Jim. I remember meeting Jimmy, and I'd been invited to an after-conference party at a Russian oligarch's apartment overlooking Red Square. And at the room I had Jimmy Rogers, Nassim Taleb, and a few others. And Nassim Taleb, you know, anyone who's met him, I mean, he's great fun, but he is stark raving bonkers. And so he would come up to me and say, and he puts on this French voice, Oug Hendry, and then he said to me, who are you again? Like, Hugh Hendry. And then I'd turn around and I'd be sitting with Jimmy, and Jimmy would, you get into his trouser pocket and he'd bring out a gold coin and be like, gold, feel the gold, gold's going up, you should own gold. I'm like, yeah, no, I get that, Jimmy. And then like 5 minutes later in another conversation, he'd go into his jacket pocket and he'd bring out, I don't know, a sachet of sugar. It's like, you should be buying sugar. And I was like, Jimmy, what have you got in that suit? I mean, that's my kind of one of my memories of Jimmy. The question would be, so what's in Jimmy's trouser pocket today? you can tack that on to the end.
I certainly remember all of that, and I hope you did I hope you did make some money and some of those things back in those days. At the moment, what's in my pocket now? I have some gold in my pocket, but I'm not buying gold. Sugar would be a better buy here than gold. Agriculture would be a better. Russia would be a better buy. When I was there in those days, I was very, very, very negative on Russia. I first went to Russia in 1966 as a student and came away saying this will never work, and came away bearish for the next 48 years. But now I'm very, very bullish. I'm very bullish on Russia. Russia is certainly a hated market. There's no question. And whenever you find a hated market, if there's something there that's changing, and I find changes have taken place and are taking place in Russia, then I would suggest he put some Russian rubles, put some rubles in your pocket. You might try the Russian ETF, might be better than the rubles, but I own both.
Okay. I'll pass both on to Hugh and see if he's got room in his pockets. He could turf out some of the rubles and buy an ETF.
Better still would be Russian government bonds in rubles.
His pockets probably aren't big enough to house the number of rubles he'd need, but we'll pass that on to him, Jim. Thanks very much. Now, from the audience, we've got a few questions here, and the first one that struck me was this one. In your recent Real Vision interview, you recommended people take a look at North Korea because no one was looking at it. What do you make of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula right now? And that's from Simon Mason.
Well, it's a very, very good question. I obviously do not have investments in North Korea. I don't know what the kid is doing. The Chinese have told the kid that if he starts a war, they will not help him. They've also told the kid that if the Americans start a war, they will help him. So, and the South Koreans have said, we're not going to have a war. But the kid keeps doing all of this. Now, the risk, of course, is that Donald Trump does something, that he gets into a fit of emotion. And many wars do start with leaders getting into emotional fits. I certainly do not have investments in North Korea. I am not investing in North Korea. I do have some in South Korea. I'm looking for ways to invest in the eventual unification. One of two things is going to happen, Grant. There's going to be a war, and that's the end of North Korea. And it'll be a fantastic investment. Korea, the whole Korean country will be unified, will be a great investment. Or there's not going to be a war, and there's going to be a peaceful unification eventually. Either way, a unified Korea is going to be the most exciting country in the world for a decade or two. It's right on the Chinese border, 80 million people, cheap, disciplined, educated labor in the north with lots of natural resources. In the south, fabulous infrastructure, capital management ability. It's going to be a very exciting country. Japan's against it because Japan knows they cannot compete with a unified Korea. America's against it because they don't want to have to take their troops out of there. But for the world, and when it happens, it's going to be very, very exciting.
What do you, when you think about that and you look back to the unification of Germany, for example, that was a very expensive project, and I can't imagine that integrating North Korea into or joining the two Koreas would be any cheaper than the German experiment. How do you think that happens? If is that something that the Americans, the Chinese will all eventually end up having to try and help pay for because they all want some stability there, or is it something that the Koreans are going to have to figure out a way on their own?
For what it's worth, The Economist magazine recently did a study and showed that they say it would cost, I think, $1 trillion. The unification would cost South Korea $1 trillion, but they would get 11 trillion of benefits from a unification. It's different, in my view. It's different from Germany. There was nobody with any money. Poland didn't have any money. Russia didn't have. None of the neighbors had any money when the Germans united. This time, everybody around them has money, including Samsung, including a lot of South Korean companies that are already trying to do business in North Korea. So I would find that it will not be the same as it was in East Germany, because the neighbors, the friends, there are plenty of people who see the opportunities to invest in a unified Korea.
Well, plus I guess these days $1 trillion is not an awful lot of money anymore.
I know, but making
helps.
11 times on your money is still a nice thing to do.
That's a good investment. Okay, next question, inflation. Hugh Hendry closed down his fund last week. Do you see the hedge fund industry struggling? And is the move to passive investing going to continue? And if so, is that dangerous? And that's from Danny Driscoll.
Well, I use passive investing partly because I'm lazy and, it's so easy to do it. Now, if you want to invest in a country, just find the ETF and do it. That obviously leaves a lot of opportunities for the companies that are not in the ETF, but I'm too lazy to go out and look at all of them. As far as the hedge fund industry, yes, but there are what, 35,000 hedge funds in the world now? Well, Grant, we don't have that many smart 29-year-olds in the world.
That's right.
We've got to have problems coming. There's been a big bull market for 8-9 years now. No, when the next problem comes, you're going to see a lot of people get wiped out. I hope I'm not one of them. I don't have a hedge fund, but I hope I'm not one of them.
All right, and the last question I'm going to ask you is this one, a very simple question, but it's a question that I really like, which is, Jim, what's the best piece of advice you were ever given by anybody? And that's from Ian Walker.
Well, follow the money. I'm trying to teach my children, when they see something on television, okay, figure out who's going to make the money. Figure out where the incentives are, and then you can figure out what's going to happen and why it's going to happen. I mean, it's simple advice. It's something which a lot of people say, but not many people do it. But I have learned, just figure out who's paying that guy off or who's going to pay that guy off. That senator, that politician, that whatever. If you can figure that out, you're probably going to find a lot of opportunities.
And I guess that's one investing constant that works wherever you go in the world.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm trying to teach my children is what we talked about before, is to figure out your own passion, and that's what you should do in life. The people who do what they love never go to work. They just wake up and start having fun every day. And those are usually the